Good afternoon, everybody. Hope everything's going well. We're just going to wait a minute or two for everybody to gradually trickle in, and then we'll get started. So just a bit of background for those who are still coming in. My name's Dan Graser. I teach at Grand Valley State University in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And since 2010, it's been my privilege to be soprano player of the Cinta Quartet. And so today's presentation is not really just going to be about us. It's mainly about kind of a unique education that we all got once we became a professional chamber ensemble, once we became a managed chamber ensemble. But our path to that was very similar to a lot of student quartets' paths, and there are also some very large differences there. So I want to make this as useful as I can. A bunch of people already asked questions about various things, in the Facebook post that I made about this. So I've tried to include all those. I got a bunch of direct messages too. But of course, at the end of this, I'm happy to take some questions in the chat. And feel free to write them as I go and as you think of them. People were kind of curious in a little bit of soprano saxophone specific things. And so I will get to that at the very end. I'm not going to go really long on that because that's not, our topic for today. But I would be happy to answer any questions, either through Facebook or through my email, which is on Grand Valley's website. But anyway, so I think we'll get started. So I'm going to share my screen and hopefully this all works with you. But it's a bit of a PowerPoint presentation. So anyway, so there's the header there. So one of the things that makes our quartet unique is that we've had access to parts of the chamber music and classical music world that has been kind of off limits for saxophone a lot of times. And this was something that really kind of re-educated us as young musicians, because this isn't something that's normally covered in a lot of music programs. I got my doctorate without knowing what half the words I'm going to talk about later actually meant when it came to the music business. And I think these days people are getting a bit better about that. A bit more entrepreneurial, but hopefully this serves as a useful introduction to some of those. And so just really quickly on our formation here, we kind of had an unusual formation in that we formed by audition. The Michigan Symphony Band decided to do a tour of China in 2011. And it was the 50th anniversary of when the Michigan Symphony Band toured the Soviet Union and the Near East. And back then in 1961, there was a student soloist with the group, and his name was Donald Cinta. And so half a century later, he had been teaching at University of Michigan for almost 40 years, and they wanted to feature saxophone again. And they decided that they would bandistrate Bill Bolcom's Concerto Grosso, which was originally Sax Quartet and Orchestra, commissioned by the Prism Quartet, which is another U of M group. And so they bandistrated it. We auditioned to be in the symphony band for the tour. And after that, the section auditioned to be in the feature quartet. And we all auditioned on our respective instruments, soprano, alto, tenor, and baritone. In terms of our name, we decided, for the reasons that I kind of just listed, that the reason why we were forming was entirely because Don was the student soloist. The reason why we were at U of M to begin with was because Don, was the professor there, that we would name ourselves the Donald Cinta Quartet. And I asked the conductor of the Michigan Symphony Band, Michael Haithcock, about the idea. And he says, "I love it. Don't tell Don." Because Don's not a huge fan of having the spotlight on him. He's a bit shy and a bit of a recluse in some regards. So we didn't tell him until the week of the performance when the programs came out. And we decided that, some quartets, you have the Emerson Quartet named after a poet, you have the Juilliard Quartet named after an institution, why not name yourselves, after your great teacher? And so it's stuck ever since. And just a bit of a quick announcement, we're actually going to be abbreviating our name to the Sinter Quartet officially in the coming week or so. But anyway, the very first bit of repertoire that we had was already set for us by nature of being in the group, because we were going to record and premiere the band version of Bochum's Concerto Grosso in February of 2011, and we formed in November of 2010. So all of our rehearsing preliminarily was done on one piece. And it was done on a piece that we were told by Don we were going to do from memory. And so the very first thing we ever did was learn a large concerto as a quartet and prepare to memorize it. And so that's where our rehearsals were focused. Outside of some warm-ups and some intonation work, we went right into the Bochum every rehearsal. And so February of 2011, we recorded it, which was a really great process. That recording is out on a CD with a whole bunch of the other premieres from that. Kristen Custer wrote a violin concerto for this. Michael Dougherty wrote a new band piece, Lost Vegas, for this. And so it's a wonderful recording. And that was a very unique experience. It was our first experience with the process of recording that Professor Tamer Sullivan so wonderfully detailed in his presentation. And then in terms of, sticking together as a quartet, we were really formed for a purpose, which was to do the tour and to make the recording. And we hadn't really set down any long-term plans really after the tour. And so that summer was kind of like quartet limbo, to the point where as we approached the end of the summer, we kind of decided that we were going to make a go of it, that we were going to stick together, and as many groups do, in order to have some sort of directed purpose, we decided to plan on some competitions. And so I want to talk just briefly on this next slide about competitions, because you'll hear, pedagogically speaking, a lot of people will talk about them in very positive or negative or a mix, or that it's, a student by student case. And I want to sort of detail it as to what it can do for a young chamber group, and realize this is general advice. Advising students to do competitions is, done on a personal basis, on our relationship as teacher and student. But hopefully you find some of these general recommendations helpful. So I'm framing this in two ways, in terms of, as a young chamber ensemble, what can competitions do for you and what they can't. So number one, what can they do for you? Absolutely build your portfolio. Having a lot of placements, having, some competition victories in your resume is a great thing. And your peers will recognize that. And we all know about all the various competitions and how they're judged and all that sort of thing. And, if a quartet has a few successes, or, and not just first places, but if they've, gotten a place in some of these quartets, that's, very well responded to by your peers. And then among professionals, recently in 2018, we did our very last competition, which was Fish Off, having not done it for a while, and I'll get into that in the next slide. And the reason we did it is that professionals in the field all have their certain competitions that they're very well aware of, and that they look to for perhaps to present a group, or perhaps to manage a group, or just in terms of general regard. They look to these specific competitions. And one that we got asked about a lot, even though at that point we had won a bunch of others, was, have we ever done Fish Off? And we had. It's just that the results weren't very good. So certain competitions in the professional field are still very highly regarded. And then more importantly, I think, or more directly, especially while you're a student, is that competitions can and will make you a better ensemble in a couple of ways. First of all, personally. That is, in prepping for a competition, and a lot of the students here and professors will know this, that as you prepare for one, it's a bit of a high stress scenario, even spread across 3 or 4 months of preparation. And so you either learn to work together or you don't. And so you really learn how to function as an ensemble, that you're not just 4 individuals, that, as the soprano player, you are not, some sort of old school first violin that's there to, lead the group. It's much more like egalitarian than that. And you plainly learn how to rehearse. You learn how to deal with each other. You learn how to have productive rehearsals regularly. And if you have a bad one or an unproductive one, or there's, personal problems, you learn how to work them out as a group of young adults and as a group of adults these days. Well, most of us in the quartet are adults. And then also on a personal note, you learn how to take criticism. And this will come into play on the next slide that I show, but you're not going to win everything. You're not going to place in everything. You might not even make the live rounds of everything you apply for. That's the normal. That's as it is. It's a very competitive field. And one thing that you learn from doing this is that you learn how to, even though you're frustrated with the result, you learn how to take the notes, take the judge's remarks, take the feedback from your teacher, from your peers who heard you along the way, and you learn how to make that constructive, and you learn how to make that productive, rather than just being frustrated and thinking that, well, they just didn't get it, okay? Because learning to take criticism is something that, I think everybody could be a little bit better at. And normally we're very good about that on student to teacher relationship. You're getting critique every week, but then to have it done in competition and to have a result that, it really doesn't go your way, that can be kind of a deflating thing. And so it's important to recognize that that is something you can get better at. Okay. Anyway, musically speaking, how are you going to get better? Well, you're going to be a tighter ensemble, plain and simple. Through rehearsing competition repertoire and preparing for a competition, you will get tighter as an ensemble in terms of everything about your musicality. You will, over time, develop a group sound. When you're first starting out, especially if perhaps not everybody in the group has played their respective instruments as a specialty before, they're still kind of figuring out what their sound is individually. So you have some time to figure out your group sound. Over the course of preparing for a competition, you will figure out what your group sound is. And also, you'll establish your repertoire. So when you compete, especially in competitions where the repertoire isn't spelled out completely, what repertoire does your group sound better than most at? Or what worked particularly well, what didn't work well with certain judges, what worked well with saxophone judges that doesn't work well with other judges. One general remark that I usually suggest for folks doing mixed competitions like Fish Off and various others is that if you do transcriptions or arrangements, especially of string music, realize that you are taking a bit of a risk, because in that repertoire, judges already have a well-formed opinion as to how that piece should sound. And so as an example, even playing one of the pieces that we later recorded, we were told in a certain competition, a certain year, I won't mention any names, for 2 completely opposite reasons, that our performance of something was not correct. Not just that they didn't like it, but that it was not correct. And one person said our tempo was way too fast, and then our articulations were way too harsh. And then the person said that this was actually quite a bit too slow, and you want to make your articulations a lot clearer. We did Dvorak in one competition and got the remark that we weren't playing Dvorak eighth notes. I have a doctorate. I have a bachelor's degree in music history and theory. I've never learned about Dvorak eighth notes, so if you already know about those, maybe you're ahead of the game. That's a little sarcasm. And then in terms of what they should not do for you. And number one, personally speaking, you're not going to make money off of these. The prize money will probably take care of your travel, maybe. But you're not going to get rich playing chamber competitions. And I think most people know that. Number two, you shouldn't be looking to these to feed your ego. Because first of all, it's weird to go to strangers to have your ego fed. But number two, you're not going to have uniformly positive results. And if you're insecure about a lot of things, this can be a very frustrating thing to do. And like I said, give yourself time to get better at it. You might be very frustrated with the first competition result that you don't like, and it may not be easy to make that a constructive and productive endeavor, but you'll get better at it. And you'll go into them realizing that you're not there to, feed anyone's ego. You're there to give a really great performance, and the results will be what the results will be. Okay. And then professionally, what you don't want to have as a thought when you compete is the notion that you're competing against your peers. This is a very small business, is a very small world in terms of the classical music world, chamber music world, and we all know each other. Don't harbor any sort of, weird animosity because you're of the same age level as a certain number of other students and groups and whatnot, and think that you're always competing against them. You're competing with them. You're all trying to make each other better. You're not trying to be better than them. You're trying to be better than you were yesterday. And then lastly, the notion that even if you win all of these, that you're just going to be handed a professional career. It doesn't happen. There's a whole lot of work to do to bridge the gap, even for a very successful competitive quartet, to actually have a career in the chamber music world beyond just the handful of things that might be thrown at you from your latest competition victory. There's a whole skill set that needs to be developed there, and managers and promoters and presenters are not just going to be flocking to you because you got a gold at Fish Off or a first at Emprise or whatever. There's a whole lot of work that you have to do after that. So anyway, so much for competitions. Just a few notions about that specifically pertain to the chamber music world. So moving on, in the interest of being absolutely forthcoming with our competitions that we've done, on the left here, you'll see the ones that appear in our bio. Okay. And that's what you'll see in everybody's bio is that, oh, look, they were successful everywhere. Okay. What they don't show you is this part of it. Okay. And so, like I said, we in 2018, we won Fish Off. In 2012 and 2013, we made the live rounds that didn't get anywhere after that. In 2012, we made the finals of Coleman, didn't place. And then in 2016, the year before we won first at Emprise, we got second for wins at Emprise. And I show that just to sort of be absolutely forthcoming and let you know, you're not always going to get the best result possible. And what you have to learn to do is learn how to make it productive. And realize that if you don't place or if you don't get first, that does not mean that you necessarily failed. It's only a failure if you don't learn anything from it. And hopefully after each one of these, you solicit feedback from the judges. If it isn't immediately provided to you, certainly ask for it. And you try and make your rehearsals better. Maybe you learn something about the repertoire you chose, how certain people reacted to it. Even if you disagree with their reaction, did you learn something from their disagreement? So much for competitions, okay? So here I just want to sort of lay out some terminology. I call it Chamber Music Industry 101, just because a lot of this is stuff that isn't covered in our regular curriculum. And That's slowly changing. But these were all terms and concepts, with which we were completely unfamiliar, really up until about 2013, at least in any specific sense. So in terms of management, there are many different types of management firms that are available to classical musicians and to chamber musicians. There are very large international firms, the type of people who manage Yo-Yo Ma, Renee Fleming, Emerson Quartet, firms like IMG and Opus 3 and various others. They're huge. They have a huge staff. They have a huge roster. They're very expensive to get on, but once you're there, they book very successfully. You have boutique firms, and all that means is that it's a firm that deliberately makes itself small and focused on a certain number of ensembles and sometimes a certain type of ensemble. So they may feel eminently qualified to book piano trios, and that's what they do entirely. Or they may decide that they're going to book any type of chamber ensemble, but they're going to limit themselves to 6. And that's all they do. Developmental managers are ones that, in addition to being management, are also there to provide some sort of arts education. And so, the Concert Artists Guild, who we work with, that's their mission. Astral, who have had a number of saxophonists on their roster, do similar thing, have a management roster and also guide you through that. Young Concert Artists just opened it up to saxophone this year, and Stephen Banks won that competition. So now he's on their roster. Similar thing. It's a great management firm, but they also give you career advice and kind of guide you into the field, as opposed to just you're now managed and hopefully you get some gigs. They actually help connect the dots. A presenter is the person who actually books you, the person who runs a concert series. And more important than running the concert series, they're the people who cultivate their local audiences. So when you play at a venue, and there's 100 people there to hear string quartet, saxophone quartet, the reason they're there is that presenter cultivated a very good relationship with their audience. But they are the people who actually book you. Promoters can work for any number of people. If they're functioning independently, they can be contracted by presenters to promote their concerts. They can be contracted by managers to promote their artists, or they can be contracted by record labels to promote an upcoming release. Publicist is usually employed or contracted by a presenter or a record label, and their job is to get you, as you can see, in publications. So not just published on their website, but to get reviews and to get ads in key magazines, periodicals, online magazines, that sort of thing. Arts conferences. And so these are, again, something I wasn't particularly aware of as a student, but now I realize how important they are. These are organizations that hold conferences, sometimes yearly, sometimes multiple times a year, sometimes biannually. And what they do is get together and talk about every issue pertaining to the music industry, but also they get together and hear showcase performances from soloists, from chamber groups, from every possible combination. And so a few of them that you may want to be aware of: CMA is Chamber Music America, probably most specific to what we as a group do. They meet every January in New York City for a conference. APAP, Association of Performing Arts Presenters, that is chamber music plus soloists plus jazz bands plus funk bands plus anything you can think of, any sort of performing arts, visual. And so it's a huge conference that usually takes place in New York every January as well. Arts Midwest, I think you can assume where that takes place. Western Arts Alliance, ISPA, International Society for Performing Artists. So there are a number of conferences and organizations that are there to provide forums to discuss issues about the music industry, but also where presenters and managers will gather to hear and hopefully maybe fill up their concert series for the next year. They will literally book artists at these events, and managers will show up and be there and draw up contracts, and you will get gigs right at the conference. I just kind of mentioned what showcasing is. When you do a showcase performance, that's a performance that is almost exclusively for presenters and managers. So your audience consists of people that you want to connect with in a business sense. And normally at any of these conferences, if you wish to showcase, it'll be juried. As you can imagine, they're very competitive. But it's something that if you're interested in booking gigs and you've got a pretty good portfolio made up, ready to go, it's certainly something for a young group to consider. I wouldn't recommend that as your first step because, as I said, you're competing with, to showcase at these events, the young, hot, internationally successful string quartets as well. And so if you're only been together for 2 years or something like that, that's not going to work. But for young groups who have decent resumes already and are looking to maybe get some gigs, it's a possibility. Again, very competitive. There was a question on my original post about this event about self-management. And so I just want to briefly talk about that. It is what it says it is. You perform two roles. You're a musician and you're also your own manager and promoter. Some people prefer to do this. Others are forced to do it. And to make the best of it, you really do have to devote as much time to it as you do to your practice and to your art. So with and without management it's a different scenario. If you have a manager, normally they'll take about 20% of your earnings. So if you're in a quartet, it's almost like having a fifth member, but they're at all these conferences promoting you, they're booking you, they're negotiating higher and higher fees. If you are self-managing, you have to do all that yourself. There are a lot of resources online in terms of drawing up contracts, or if you want to get an estimate as to what your artist fee should be. It's initially very, very difficult to self-manage because the chamber music business and the classical music business is about as old school as it gets when it comes to booking gigs, in that you really have to know people directly. Some people think that, well, I'm going to self-manage and I'll just send out my portfolio and recordings to, every person they can think of. And just realize that if you're contacting a presenter about wanting to perform on their series, you're probably one of about 150 emails that they've gotten that week about wanting to perform on their series. They delete all those if they even allow it to be filtered into their inbox at all. To actually get a gig and to actually work with a presenter, you want to start with people you know. And if you know someone who is on the board of a management company, of an arts firm, of a chamber music series, of any sort of concert series, and they know you and they know you're playing, their personal recommendation will carry much more weight than probably 100 emails will. Also, if you're self-managing, I would really encourage you to try and showcase as much as you can, so that presenters and managers are aware of you, and so that you get on their radar, because you can't just expect that you're going to send somebody a link to a whole bunch of resources, and that these presenters will have the time to go through hundreds of these a week. It doesn't happen. So as a self-manager looking for gigs, start with the people you know, start locally, and then presenters talk. So if you create a really great impression on that first gig, other people will book you based on that presenter's recommendation. That's what I mean when it's kind of old school and very personal. That is the most successful way to do it. Let's see, recording has already been talked about in another presentation. Just realize that you always hear about how the classical music recording industry is dying. We've been hearing about that for half a century. It's eternally dying, it seems. Realize that people only publish that when it's a slow week in the arts section of their paper. Record labels. There are the big ones that everybody knows about: Deutsche Grammophon, Sony Classical, stuff like that. Boutique labels that specialize. Their specialty might be new music. It might just be chamber music. There are independent record labels that might be run by one musician. And in terms of working with them, you just want to make sure that you're working with somebody who's competent, that has a track record of getting materials reviewed, published, out in the public eye. And also, if you're going to use that record label for mixing, mastering, and editing, that you hear their work and that you know who they're going to use as their mastering engineer and as their mixing engineer, and that you can hear a sample of that. As an example, our latest recording, Ex Machina, we work with a wonderful small independent record label called Bright Shiny Things. It's run by the bassist of another chamber ensemble called Sybarite 5. And the person who ended up mastering that recording, Andrew Bove, is the guy who makes, you may have seen these gigantic brass videos of Game of Thrones tracks on YouTube. He's the guy who does the audio for those, but he had also done the mixing and editing and mastering for the Metropolitan Opera brass recordings. So again, we knew what the quality was. The recording engineers are the people there in the session who set up the microphones. And again, Tamer's presentation was very thorough about this. We use Solid Sound in Ann Arbor for what we do. The first time we really found our microphone setup that really worked for us, they took pictures of it and they adjusted, each time we went to a session, they made sure to have it clear to our specifications. And we're really happy with that. Editing, mixing, and mastering, that can be done by your engineers. That can be done by your record label. That can be done by another firm. And so they're the people who take all of that raw material and make it actually sound like a genuine performance, not like it was recorded in a very small, dry studio. A lot of chamber music ensembles, function off of grants. And whenever you're considering applying for grants for various initiatives that you have, always don't just think federal, grants. Think, well, we have to get a Copeland Foundation grant. Otherwise this won't work. Think locally, think at the state level, then federal. And nowadays we have crowdsourcing as well. So try and engage with it at all those levels and make sure to do your homework on that. Some ensembles incorporate as a nonprofit or an LLC. Usually that's either as a 501c3 to be eligible for a certain number of federal grants. And as an LLC, it's to be easily paid by your management firm so that you're not all paid individually, but you can be paid as one LLC. And also the words classical saxophone round this out. And I use those two words there in quotes because a lot of times, people don't like to call it that. They'll call it concert saxophone. I would advise against that because presenters, managers, they don't know what that means. They assume that you play concerts. Why would you call it concert saxophone? And even though, saxophonists have been successful recently, the idea that they're going to understand our lingo takes a little bit of working. So, we call ourselves a classical saxophone quartet or a contemporary saxophone quartet, and they know what we're talking about. Those who have preconceived notions about this, who admittedly are very few, they're not, aware of what goes on at NASA conference every year regionally or biennially. So, they may think that you do a certain proportion of jazz or commercial music. And so in terms of defining your group, when you do that, you want to make sure that you're absolutely clear what it is you do, because just calling yourself a concert saxophone group, that conjures up really no imagery or knowledge in presenters or managers' minds. Okay. So just being a little bit more specific, when you're considering going into the professional world as a chamber ensemble, you want to consider what is your mission, both immediately and also 10 years down the road. And our mission is to perform and be booked just as if we were a string quartet, so that they don't consider us some weird exotic thing that they tacked onto their chamber series, but that they feel as confident booking us as they would the up and coming string quartets. And one concept that was actually first introduced to me in Angela Miles Beeching's book, Beyond Talent, having an elevator speech. And that's just music business and actually business in general lingo for being able to describe what you do in about 30 seconds or less, maybe in one statement or two. So that if you only have 30 seconds in an elevator with a presenter or a manager, what will you say about your group? So if I were to, come up with one for our group, and I certainly have previously, it would be, well, we're a contemporary saxophone quartet that performs everything from the Romantic era string quartets to the music being written by today's up and coming composers. We perform entirely from memory, and we try and break down any sort of physical or perceived mental barriers between the audience and us. In that we perform entirely from memory standing, and we also speak about everything we do over the course of the performance, turning it into an engagement as opposed to just a dry recital. That might be one quick elevator speech. Depends who you're talking to, of course. And then what's your mission relative to the chamber music world and to the saxophone world? And so finding your place in both, takes time and figuring out. Programming. When you do arrangements and transcriptions, what are you hoping to accomplish with those? And when you do them, realize again, you're instantly going to be compared with the original ensemble. So does your interpretation hold up to what people already think of when they think of Dvorak American or Beethoven or Shostakovich? And if you're going to do that and try and make that part of your profile, you want to play everything up to an extremely high level, but realize that when you choose to do that repertoire, and that's part of your offering, people are going to choose or not choose you based on how well you do it compared to the original group for which it was written. Saxophone quartet standards. Just realize that has no meaning for most presenters or managers, and that if you want to present standard saxophone repertoire, great. They don't know what that is. And so if you're going to present that on a program, it has to work with the whole program. We know that the Glazunov is a standard. They don't. When they see that on there, they assume that somebody arranged it from a string quartet. So, or if you're going to do Pierne, or if you're going to do some Maslanka, which we all know of as standards on a program, there has to be some other reason besides it being a saxophone standard, because they don't know what those are. And programming new music, again, part of your group's identity. If you decide to be an entirely new music group, if you decide to do a bit of that on every program, if you decide to directly commission things or be a part of consortia, we run a composition competition for students every year. We've been a part of various consortia that have been put together by our friends in other quartets. The Ex Machina piece was a consortium put together by Project Fusion, and various other quartets, Barcata and others have put together consortia that we've been a part of, which is a good way to get a bunch of groups playing one piece, and you get a great piece by a composer for a reduced fee because you're all in on it. And then lastly, the last section there, liaison with artist management. Mainly what you do there is that you're working with your managers. In this case, I'm the primary liaison from our group to our managers. So if they have a quick question that they just need an answer to, regarding logistics or regarding the music or maybe program notes or anything like that, or a last minute request from the presenter, they talk to me. And they may ask, for various things that, we had a presenter ask if we could do some light holiday music. and they were looking for something that was kind of, in a commercial or a pop or somewhat of a jazz realm. And that's not what we do. And so, you say this nicely, but you're very clear that, well, no, we couldn't quite do that, but we certainly could do maybe some holiday Renaissance music. And they actually liked that. And that was what we ended up doing. Or people will ask us, well, could you do maybe 15 minutes of Gershwin on this program? And, if that's, you want to be flexible, but you also want to make sure that you're not faking. And we were asked to do jazz on, one of our programs, and they were looking for almost half the program to be that. And I was very clear that, thank you for the interest in the group, but for us to do that would not be authentic. That's not what we do. We all love jazz. We all listen to it. We've all played it. We've all studied it. We're not a jazz quartet. And to present ourselves as if we were would be dishonest. And if people are looking for that, they can look at other groups, because that's not what we do. So like I said, being flexible but firm with your ensemble's identity. Don't think that you're going to be able to do everything, because you are judged on everything you do. And everything you do should be what you are best at. And if you're presenting stuff that you actually don't believe in or don't think you're among the best at, that's not really a tenable professional solution. So I tend to think of what we do going in all four directions. So number one is looking forward, that you have to be involved in commissioning new music as a young saxophone group, okay? Because the best music for saxophone quartet is still being written. You should also, what we do is we look back to the great string quartets and think about what would work, what would we want to perform, what wouldn't work, and forming a program of repertoire that maybe presenters are more familiar with, perform to our standard. And, once they've heard you do that repertoire, perhaps they might be more accepting of some of the repertoire they've never heard of, because they know that the quality of your playing from the repertoire they already know is pretty high. And then you want to be looking to your sides. So one of our interests is in folk and traditional music of various ethnicities. And so looking what modern folk musicians are doing with various repertoire, seeing if it would work, and then some commercial music, so is there any sort of film or more popular music that would still be within your identity and would work for saxophone? And so we've done a little bit of Michael Nyman, some of his film music. We've done a bit of Radiohead as well. So stuff like that. So that's our repertoire identity. In all four directions there. Looking ahead, I was asked about arranging and transcribing for quartet. And as I said, for competitions, I'm not sure that this is a hugely great idea. But if you're, if that's your identity, absolutely go for it. In terms of thinking about what you want to get out of an arrangement, in terms of the reaction of the saxophone world, has this been done before? Are you merely modifying a pre-existing one? Are you making a whole new one? And is this going to be, maybe a desirable arrangement for the rest of the saxophone community? How will non-saxophone chamber musicians react? So this is something I think about a lot when arranging string music for saxophone. And that when you take some of their core repertoire, some of their sacred repertoire, some people can be a little bit perturbed by that. Hopefully until they hear you play it and realize that you're honoring that. And then reaction of presenters and managers. Is this going to be useful repertoire for your program offerings, or is this just, a one-off? When you're a professional group and you're going to be doing an arrangement, you really don't want to be doing a one-off arrangement. You want something that would live on your concert offerings maybe for a few years. And so we usually make 3 programs every year that we offer to presenters, and one of them will be entirely string quartet music. And so you want to think about, how does this translate to quartet? And I won't go, really deep into this, because Matt Evans did a great presentation on arranging for saxophone, so I'd encourage you to check that out. His way of phrasing it was, when when you're arranging for a student group, it's different than if you're arranging for a group of 4 Vincent Davids. And, I love Vincent David, his playing, and that essentially is who I'm arranging for. People who are high level on their specific instrument. So I don't have a whole lot of technical limitations presented to me when I'm arranging for DSQ. So the type of arranging I do for this quartet might be different than I would for an undergrad group or for a graduate group. But you definitely want to think about how it translates. And one phrase that Tim McAllister presented in his talk, just generally about being a professional, is make the argument against what you do, so that you know what people might have against what you do, and you also might spot a flaw or anything like that. So make it very clear to yourself why this shouldn't be done, and if you still think it should be, then go. I can't emphasize enough, if you're going to arrange music for saxophone quartet, listen, listen, listen again. And one skill that you want to develop as maybe an up-and-coming young arranger for quartet is that learn, as you're listening to the original version, learn to hear it on saxophone while listening to the original, and hear what would translate well, what wouldn't. And, working through that, will this sound anything like the original? And if it won't, that's still okay. Will it sound like an acceptable alternative to the original? Because composers themselves have made arrangements of their own works that sound nothing like their original composition. Does key or pitch level matter? If we're talking broadly musicologically, probably not, but also realize that if you're going to be arranging for quartet and be, putting this out there on a professional level in competition with other groups doing this piece, if yours is in a way different key, that's going to sound odd to people who are used to hearing this piece, so I tend to keep everything at pitch. At modern pitch, that is. So when arranging Bach's music, of course, the pitch level we operate at now is not what Bach's pitch level was. But even still, if I'm going to arrange something that is currently being performed by solo pianists or by string quartets, I try and keep it the standard original pitch level. So that's just my 2 cents about that. I tend not to think about making it idiomatic for the saxophone, just because I don't think we know what idiomatic for the saxophone is yet. And we've talked a bit about the rest of that there. One thing, as you're doing your arrangement, you want to be thinking about, are you having to make a lot of concessions? And are you having to make this technically more simple than the original? If you are, you're kind of making the case that this is a lesser version. And so if you're really having to rearrange a whole lot and to shorten register, to not have the variety of articulation, to not have the variety of colors, and certain things not dynamically working at all, if you're having to make a lot of concessions, you might want to reassess. And do your best when you're doing that to listen without saxophonist ears, because that's how people are listening to you when you're a young chamber ensemble. They're not listening to you as the rest of your studio is at a studio recital, or as the rest of the saxophonists are at the NASA conference. They're listening to you in comparison with that group that they just had from the Curtis Institute who played this as it was originally written. And they're comparing you to that. If it sounds drastically more simple, you've kind of made the case against yourself. And determine what's impossible to translate to saxophone. But also, just as importantly, what can you do that's better? A lot of people think that, whenever you play a string piece, that you should always perpetually be trying to sound exactly like every single thing that string players do with that piece. And it's good to have the same amount of technical flexibility as a string player, but there are certain things that we do better. And the best that you can do with an arrangement is not just an impression of a string quartet doing it. It's a saxophone version of it. And so in various spots in the repertoire, in string quartet repertoire, there are these big cathartic moments that, are written almost as a chorale, and we can make those sound much more grand, much, much bigger and much more resonant, while also at the same time having the same softer end of the dynamic range possible. So we can have a much wider range. And so you don't want to be completely emulating a string quartet that doesn't have that same sustain and weight to their sound. If you can really bring an extra dimension to the piece, by all means do it. And so I don't want to be down on saxophone. There's a lot of things that saxophone quartet can do much better than string quartet. And presenters and general audiences notice this if you really do your homework. Always be soliciting feedback from non-saxophonists. As I said, don't be an imitation, and always think about it functionally. So I have three quick little excerpts here, and just let me know if you all can't hear these. So we're all familiar with the Ligeti six bagatelles. Most of you will know that was actually originally a solo keyboard piece, a solo piano piece called Musica Ricercata. And it was arranged for a wind quintet in the version that now most everybody knows, and then it's become a saxophone piece. And so just listening to these three versions of it, I'm not going to tell you how to listen to it or how to think about it, but what I want you to think of is, what does each version present? What are the strengths for and against each of them? Okay, so here's the original. Here's the wind quintet version. And here's the saxophone quartet version. This is a performance done by DSQ. Okay. So one question that was asked in the posting that I did on this originally was how to develop a group sound, which is a really great question. And so obviously that's something that will happen somewhat organically, but in terms of really making it happen, first of all, talk about it. what are you going for, and be specific. Try to not use language that's extremely subjective, that we're going for a dark or a bright sound or stuff like that, but really talk about it in terms of things that are tangible, and compare it to other ensembles. Experiment with this in your rehearsals, record it, and then adjust based on what you hear. We live in an age where you can have really great recordings of things very easily. So please make use of that. Having outside ears, listening to yourself outside of the group is so important. To make this work, though, I would suggest that you start simple. So if you're starting a group, and even if you're planning on doing, maybe some competitions that year, focus on one piece for a good while so that you don't have a whole program's worth of repertoire to focus on, but focus on one thing that has all the elements that you're looking to homogenize and coalesce on. That's all there. I always think of the second movement of the Glazunov quartet is great for this, because between, all those variations, you have articulation, you have a bunch of dynamic levels, you have ensemble sound, you have ensemble independence. And so you have more contrapuntal, you have more homogeneous music. So a lot of great stuff there. But start simple with one piece that you really nitpick the detail of and record yourself, and then have that be the regular standard for every other piece. I think a lot of times people kind of make the mistake of wanting to work on a whole bunch of stuff initially before they've even figured out how to work with each other, and before they've even figured out maybe what they're actually hoping to sound like. And what your group sound is can and should change as you all mature and as you all get better at your own instruments, but that's at least a good starting place. In terms of structure and balance, what makes the most sense to you? Is it a wind quintet or a wind section of an orchestra? Are you thinking of more brass quintet? Are you thinking of a string quartet, of a choral sound, or a mix of some of them? But again, when you talk about that, be specific, and even have specific recordings that you're thinking of those ensembles. And so starting out, somebody asked, how do we start ensembles on this, maybe at the middle school or intermediate level? And a couple of the volumes that I really like for this, Dave Camwell has a recent publication of 24 Bach chorales. That's SATB, which is great. There's the Rasher collection, the 5 Centuries. There's another one, I believe, that's also called Masterpieces for Saxophone Quartet, which are all shorter pieces. Mine is AATB, but I'm told that it's, I think maybe I'm just missing the soprano part. I'm told that there's an SATB version of those as well. So those are great. The Larry Teal 10 saxophone quartets, which are AATB, and then Boxman, of course. So those are great starting places for young groups at the public school level. What I'd also suggest is that be willing to do arrangements of music they like. And make sure you do your proper licensing, of course, but they're more likely to stick with it if they're also playing some of the stuff they may listen to at home on Spotify or whatever, as opposed to, doing a light version of Schubert chamber music, at the intermediate level. But in terms of group sound, what we do, I'm not going to read out all of our influences, but you can see them there. And so you'll be familiar with a lot of the wind ones there, and perhaps maybe not familiar with all of those string influences. In terms of what we directly do for balance and for ensemble tone, this is point number 3, in that the inner 2 voices focus on purity and evenness. And truth be told, we're kind of in a unique scenario as a quartet, because our 2 members on alto and tenor, Zach and Joe, were previously in another very good, very successful saxophone quartet to this one, and those were the roles they played in that. And so they were already kind of good at that. And so we, on the outer ends, myself and Danny, really tried to match in to that. And I think I probably think about matching to the baritone specifically a lot, in addition to matching with the group, but just so that, the outside of the group really matches, and that we try and balance towards some imaginary center point between alto and tenor. So some groups think of it as a pyramid kind of building up from the baritone. Other groups kind of think of it as being completely equal. And so that's literally what we think of when we do it. In terms of individuals, this is my own 2 cents about soprano tone and soprano playing in the group, is that soprano is inherently a very light and can be abrasive instrument. And so I try and think of it as being there being as much weight and warmth to my sound as possible. Then I think it can possibly blend, and that the baritone itself usually has a lot of weight to it, but isn't maybe the most warm or flexible sound. So Danny tends to think that way with it. And that the saxophones on the outer parts of the music here really focus on matching articulation, especially. There's no traditional hierarchy. A soprano player is not a first violinist from a 1900 string quartet. You are a hive mind. You are all equal in this endeavor. Rare is it that you will play music that's written as top voice melody, everybody else accompaniment for the whole thing. It just doesn't work like that. And in addition to all the influences there, I tend to think of what we do actually as being representative of really great wind and brass sections of orchestras, where you are playing 4 different instruments, but you're all making sure that the details match, the intonation matches, and that on each of your instruments, you are a specialist, as if you were the principal player of another section. So for example, in the Chicago Symphony, in their heyday of Bud Herseth, Dale Clevenger, Jay Friedman, and Arnold Jacobs, from trumpet to horn to trombone to tuba, absolutely matching so that the rest of their section does, but that the principal players are really in sync. And the same thing with those players in the New York Phil, the Berlin Philharmonic Wind Section, Emmanuel Pahud, Albrecht Meyer, Andy Otenzamer, and Stefan Schweigert, that they're all matching on very different instruments, but they are all listening as if they were a chamber ensemble in that regard. So that's what we do when it comes to group sound. So hopefully that was helpful. Now, moving swiftly on, practicing and rehearsing as a professional group, which is different than being, students who are, around each other every single darn day. Your individual practice changes completely. In rehearsals, say what has to be said constructively and professionally, and leave it at the door. Even if you're frustrated, doesn't matter. People in a professional group aren't there to snipe you. They aren't there for any other motives than to make the group sound as good as they can. So if you're flat, you're flat. If your tempo was off, or you were compressing a rhythm, or your articulation didn't match, you got to say it. You don't just let it go. And you realize that in a professional group, people are saying that to make the group sound better. They are not there to snipe at you. Okay. When working on repertoire as a professional group, front load what you do. So discuss, rehearse, and agree on your choices very early, so that when you practice that away from the group, you can actively work on your interpretation, not just knowing your part, but knowing how your group would want you to play your part. During the off season, it's great to find, maybe a week or two where you can get together as a group and have intensive rehearsals to really lay this down, and really lay down your interpretation. Because as we know, Zoom is great for stuff like this. It's absolutely terrible for, trying to rehearse as an ensemble. Nothing lines up at all. So the technology isn't there for that to work yet. If you're performing music that is an arrangement for which there are numerous recordings already, agree on the recordings you prefer for each movement, so that when you're practicing individually, you can practice along with that group. So if you're going to do, Shostakovich 8, and you want to play the first 3 movements like Emerson, and the last 2 like Pacifica, that's what you practice along with when you're playing it at home from memory as an individual. Okay. But it's always good to agree on that at the outset, so you know what you're practicing. Practice with a score. Listen just as much as you practice. And when you listen, always listen with the score. So if you're preparing for a rehearsal, you cannot just know your part, and you can't just know how the other parts go. You have to know how you fit in with the other parts. And that only comes from professional level listening and professional level practicing. Especially for music that's new, that was written for us. What we'll do is that we'll get a recording of it from a recent performance of ours, or maybe from a rehearsal run through that has our interpretation on it. And when we're practicing individually, we will practice with a recording of ourselves doing it. That's immensely helpful, especially for tempos and for style things, and for the little quirks that your group brings to that piece. Okay, so practicing along with the recording of yourself doing what you intend to do is very, very helpful. So definitely plan on that, especially, like I said, if it's a piece that nobody else has recorded or isn't even on YouTube yet from anyone. And some more practical suggestions there, which you can read. I won't read that to you there. When we schedule concerts, we make sure that we have adequate rehearsal time the day before, that we have time the day of the concert to rehearse in the hall, and then when possible, rehearse the day after the performance for the next gig on our calendar. Okay. You know, because one thing that's unusual about what we do compared to academia is that we might play the same program 35 times in a season. And when was the last time you played the same full program, 80 minutes of music, 35 times in one academic year? Doesn't happen a whole lot. But that's the way it is when you tour with 3 different programs. So you want to make sure that performance number 30 sounds just as good as number 10, as number 2, and all that, you know, that each audience gets you at your very best. And practicing in the way that I described above here will certainly ensure that. The question was asked about, you know, how did we manage to stay together as a group after going our separate ways in terms of teaching? And I will say that you know, a lot of that is driven by personal ambitions, what you're hoping to get out of this. I think I could speak for the rest of our group when I say that probably the best performing each one of us has done has been as a member of this quartet. So the strength of the music making goes a long way because it's really the best musical experience that we all get on a regular basis. I think the other thing that's important is that everybody has equal expectations from the group, that when I show up to a performance or a rehearsal, that they assume that that is the very best a quartet soprano saxophonist can sound. And if not, that's a problem, because I know that respectively, they're going to bring the very best quartet, alto, tenor, and baritone playing. And so you all need to have those equally high expectations. And if you do, that really helps things work professionally. You need a sense of mission for the group. One reason why a lot of groups kind of fizzle after everyone kind of graduates or gets jobs in different states and all that sort of thing is that there really was no group mission. They, you know, rehearsed, they did competitions and weren't really aiming toward anything. So having an actual mission that you're all actively thinking about, even when you're away from each other, that helps. The strength of the music. If I'm asked, I think the best music written for saxophone is written for saxophone quartet. And so I think the music goes a long way. And then you have to treat each other as professionals. You may end up being very good friends. That's not necessary. You just have to be professional. It makes life a whole lot easier if you wind up being friends, and don't try and fake it. You know, if you're not going to be friends with someone, if they're, that's not going to work, then don't force that. Just be professionals. We're lucky enough that, we're a group of 4 best friends. I was just the best man at another member of our quartet's wedding. I mean, so this isn't fake. It's a good professional and collegial relationship. But in terms of keeping it together, that's what's kind of necessary, because if that isn't established before you all go your separate ways, what frequently happens in a chamber group is that different people will take the group seriously to a different degree. Some won't at all. Some people will really want this to be, really high level, really gung-ho about it. And other people will just be along for the ride. If they're on equal expectations and on equal preparation, that's frequently what will drive a wedge between a group. So hopefully that's helpful. I'm happy to hear any follow-up questions on that. And then just as a culminating slide on saxophone, just to talk about, I've kept saying like the chamber music world, the classical music industry, and these are the that accounts for all the string quartets, piano trios, brass quintets, wind quintets, reed quintets, everybody out there performing on series these days. And so just to give you a sense as to what what they think of saxophone, I think as saxophonists, probably all of you, especially classical saxophonists, you probably all have heard the expression, "I've never heard a saxophone sound that way before." Realize that that's frequently a compliment, because they came to that concert not knowing what they were going to hear, but they came anyway. And so they're curious, and so they're interested, and you want to cultivate that response. So if they present that to you, give them a listening list. It's like, oh yeah, there's a whole wealth of classical saxophone recordings, and here are a couple of other ensembles, and here's our recordings, here's this other group's really great recordings, here's two of the composers that write really well for saxophone to check out. Do they have any preconceived notions? A lot of times they don't. If you call yourself a classical saxophone quartet, like I said, they don't have any aural image already going on. So sometimes they'll assume that you'll have kind of a jazz sound to what you do. They won't be expecting your aesthetic. And gradually that's slowly changing. But even still, that's the vast majority of the field really doesn't have a preconceived notion of what classical saxophone is, and despite the fact that we rightly celebrate saxophone success on, various competitions like Fish-Off and whatnot, in the past 2 or 3 decades, saxophone has routinely maybe won every year, every other year, the wind division of Fish-Off. And how many professional chamber music gigs has that turned into? And that's where that divide is. And that's where you want to work on bridging the gap between competition success and then chamber music, classical music industry success. And so that's why a lot of people, even though we think, well, we're doing so well at these chamber competitions, yeah, but in terms of presence on classical music and chamber music stages, it's actually still somewhat scattershot. So we still have some work to do there. Performing from memory, it's something that we still do because we really enjoy it. One reaction that I've noticed about performing from memory is that the audience remembers the whole experience more vividly when they remember that one thing that you did that was special. Outside of being a saxophone group, it's like, oh yeah, they were the ones who played entirely from memory, and then they can talk about your whole program. Whereas if you perform exactly the way a string quartet does, or that the other quartets in their series did, where you go and sit down and play some music and then don't talk to them at all, that seems like a disengaged performance. But we've noticed that audiences really like that there's no perceived physical barrier of the stand or the, between them and us, but also that we talk to them. And also performing music from memory is very exciting. It forces you to learn the entirety of the piece. So we absolutely still do that. Speaking to the audience, every chamber music ensemble should learn how to talk to an audience. Dry program notes are no substitute for engaging your audience personally. You're 4 people, they want to hear from 4 people. And it's okay if you suck at that right now. A lot of people suck at public speaking when they first started it, but you learn, what works, what doesn't. Try and be humorous, try and throw in whatever information you think an educated audience might need if they're hearing you for the very first time, so that they will enjoy the performance even more. What can you say or do before you play that will actually enhance their listening experience? Maybe make them remember what you do better. They absolutely love new music as long as you tell them what they're about to listen to. Even as a saxophonist, if you just sat down and played 60 minutes of discordant atonal music, I probably wouldn't be engaged that much with what you're doing. If you tell me why each piece is unique and what's going on, what to listen for, what the inspiration was, why you love performing this piece, I'll be a whole lot more engaged throughout the program. So we've already talked about the idea of there being sax quartet standards, and we've talked about arrangements. When you write program notes, read them aloud. If you get bored reading your own program notes aloud, so will your audience. Okay, so make them engaging, make them funny. Don't put in unnecessary detail that nobody outside of a musicology conference would need to know. So every little facet of this composer's life that has no bearing on the piece whatsoever, don't include that. What do they need to know to enjoy this piece more? But read it aloud and examine your style. And then in terms of performing all classical music versus multiple genres, that has to be a part of your identity. People do like that we throw in some traditional music, some folk music. The Green Groves of Erin is a popular YouTube video of ours. Excuse me, and it's also a popular encore of ours because people really enjoy the fiddle tunes arranged for saxophone quartet. But a lot of music works that way. Just make sure that, again, it's a part of your identity and that you're doing that music justice. You're not just doing kind of a pale impression of it. All right. And then in comparison with other chamber ensembles, I think the most heartening thing about our experience on the chamber music circuit is that people really love classical saxophone once they've heard it. However, it's a bit of a hurdle to climb to actually get them to hear it because it's not a household notion, even these days. So people enjoy the sound, they enjoy the repertoire. They love the kind of the curiosity that saxophonists have, how fresh it is. And so they enjoy the experience once they have it. And so the heartening thing I take away from our experience is that really audiences are looking for new things, and not just new music, but generally new sounds. And classical saxophone is a very viable one. And just getting past that very first hurdle is the most difficult spot. But in comparison with our fellow chamber ensembles of brass quintet and string quartet and piano trio and reed quintet, there are things that we can do that none of those groups can do. There are things that we can do that they can kind of do that we can do a whole lot better. And so, audiences really enjoy it once they hear it. I was asked for some specific things about my soprano playing, and this would take an entire another presentation, which I'm not going to do now, but just sort of lay the groundwork for this and maybe provoke some questions about it specifically later on. In terms of my soprano playing, just realize somebody asked me like why when I chose soprano and how I chose that as a specialty. Soprano has actually always been my favorite since high school. I've been doing this really as a specialty since about 2005. So I've got about 15 years on this instrument as a specialty, and realize a lot of this applies to playing any other member of the saxophone family as a professional. But you have to think of it as it being its own thing. This is not ancillary to your alto playing. You need to have the exact same standards for your soprano playing, in terms of your tone concept, your tessitura, musical possibilities, refinement, control, all of that stuff. You have to conceptualize it as being at the same level, because a lot of people are very strong on saxophone, on alto saxophone. Then they go to another instrument and they're a little bit lazier with the details. They don't have as clear a concept as to what they're going for. You need to be absolutely clear with that. The amount of time you spend on fundamentals and repertoire on this instrument has to be representative of what you're hoping to do with it. I want to be the soprano player of a professional quartet. As such, most of my practicing is as a soprano player in a professional quartet. So that's usually what I warm up on. A lot of my solo repertoire is there. When I was a student, I would alternate doing my warm-up routine on alto and soprano, primarily. I would alternate doing technique routines on either of those two, because I was coming to understand that was going to be my specialty. I was very lucky that my undergrad teacher was Tim McAllister. He's a wonderful soprano saxophonist in the Prism Quartet. So I had a really great model for a lot of the basics from a very young age. And about the time I got to Michigan and, I was practicing down the hall from Don in the morning, and when he heard me playing soprano the first time in our lesson afterwards, we had a discussion about, essentially he told me this needs to be maybe your primary thing. Based on the strength of what he heard, he was suggesting that this be a primary part of what I do. And I agreed. I wanted it to be. And so it's been a focus of mine for a while. You need to have notions of what's the inherent sound of the soprano, what's the sound your quartet going for, and then how do you bridge the gap between those two things? So what do you want it to sound like? What do you want your group to sound like? Your solo playing may sound different than your quartet playing. Absolutely fine. You know, the way Hilary Hahn plays is not the same way as Arnold Steinhardt. The way that Joshua Bell plays is not the way that Phil Setzer or Gene Drucker play in the Emerson Quartet. It's a different style. And so you want to make sure that that's very clear. In terms of technicalities, you can kind of see the specifics there, but make sure that when you practice voicing, it's soprano specific. Don't try to play it as an alto saxophone. It does not work. One thing that I focus on with my playing is embouchure efficiency. So I will do exercises without a break that go between the extremes of register. So when I do long tones, I'll go descending chromatically into low register, but I'll slur up 2 octaves while not moving my embouchure. And when I do them, I don't reset my embouchure in the rests. So if I take a rest, I keep the embouchure set and I breathe through my nose so that I'm literally keeping the same embouchure for as wide a range as possible. A lot of times we kind of dogmatically say that for classical saxophone, the embouchure shouldn't move. And then when people start practicing all this stuff, they're moving it all over the place. They're taking more in. They're trying to play softly, so they drop their jaw. Or they're planning to play high, so they have all this extra tension. Work on embouchure efficiency. A lot of people, you know, when they're working on an ancillary saxophone, will learn altissimo fingerings that respond the easiest, or that they think sound better than the more mechanical ones. Learn to make the most technically useful fingerings sound better. Don't think that it inherently sounds better or worse than any other fingering, and refine that so that you're not just sort of lost in the midst of really bizarre, uncomfortable, you know, non-usable fingerings that are only useful for one isolated whole note that won't work with the rest of the phrase. And again, this is speaking specifically for me. I don't really work with a lot of saxophone methods in my own practice. I tend to use flute methods. So those from Moise and Tafano Gobert, Botza, Makar, and DeBoss, their specific flute methods are great because I try and hold myself to the same technical standards of a flutist in terms of range and flexibility. And then you see what my daily routine is there on the bottom. So on that, I will turn it over to if anybody has any questions, and I will stop the share right now. So it's back to my ugly mug. Anyway, so I see there's already one there. How do ensembles receive commentary from judges? Good question. Some competitions inherently give you those. If they don't, ask for them. So whoever puts on the actual competition, whoever's organizing it, please ask them for it if they can share that. Or maybe they can give you the contact information. Sometimes they don't want to do that because otherwise judges will be pestered by a bunch of musicians and teachers wondering why the heck their ensemble didn't do better. But definitely ask the organizers of each competition if they can get feedback about that. Sometimes they can, sometimes they cannot. I'll speak directly about that. I was a prelim judge for the most recent NASA Quartet competition. They were not having us give feedback to anybody, and so I absolutely cannot. But in various chamber competitions, they will. So it never hurts to ask, and sometimes you'll be surprised what you find. Have a question from Jordan Luloff. What is DSQ focusing during this quarantine, booking for next season, projects, creating new pieces of technology, et cetera? Well, I think if you asked each of us, we'd all have a different answer. I'm in contact with our managers regularly about rebooking the concerts that we lost, obviously. We're certainly working on what our programs will be, not for this coming season and not even for the season after that, but because those are already set, but for thinking for 22, 23. I'm focusing on some arranging of some more Beethoven and some other string music. And perhaps, we're also trying to plot what our next few recording projects for in terms of CDs would be. We were trying to think about having some more video and digital content, and every group needs more of that, according to every manager who's ever lived. And we're certainly thinking about that, but there's not a whole lot that we can do about it right now. And I think we're probably of the opinion that we don't want to put out something that looks kind of just sort of thrown together based on our, the current circumstances. So I don't think we feel a whole lot of urgency to flood the market with a whole bunch of videos of all of us in our living rooms and that sort of thing. But we certainly are thinking long-term about, what we're going to offer in terms of the digital realm coming up and some more social media strategies. But yeah, a lot of programming considerations. And I think we're all also focusing individually on our own playing and just getting back to some fundamentals. So do you have recommendation? This is Mark Smith. Do you have recommendations for balancing competitive and non-competitive with young quartets in terms of repertoire? Yeah, absolutely. No, it's a good question. And I think generally speaking, there's a certain amount of training repertoire that you want to set as part of what you do generally, and specifically for each individual group. Like I know that your group, the Quantum group, is a very high level saxophone quartet, and so they're capable of things that various others would not be at that age. I do think that you want, again, like I was going back to some of the first recommendations for an ensemble, I think it's better if they start off with one simple piece that really forces them to listen as a group and take instruction, obviously from an instructor as yourself, on all of the details of quartet playing. It's much better to start simple rather than throw, a gazillion pieces at them. I think having one thing that they refine and can hear really marked improvement on, even after 1 or 2 weeks or a month's worth of rehearsing, I think that's a more rewarding experience than for them to feel like, for the first 4 or 5 months, they're just really learning their parts. So I would tend to start simple. Bach is great for this, but, something that forces them to listen independently and also listen for homogeneity. So chorales plus counterpoint, that sort of thing are great. But also starting with the simplest, let's call it the most deceptively simple bit of our repertoire. So Glazunov, or even just a slow section of Pierne, the Andante from Bozza, stuff like that. So I tend to have groups be a little bit more simplistic with their repertoire, get that to a high level to begin with, than throwing a lot of advanced stuff at them initially. In terms of competition repertoire, when you're formulating a competition program, at that point you want to know what you're best at, where the strengths lie. And I don't think you can do that unless you've done what I just said. But I think you want something that shows off the unique attributes of that ensemble. A few years ago, it was probably commonplace for every saxophone group to feel like they had to do some sort of Maslanka on their program. And Maslanka is great. Maslanka sounds wonderful. But if that's not what you sound best at, if you're going to sound a whole lot better, doing a completely different repertoire, then do that. So it has to be about your strengths and also the strength of the program. And, not every saxophone quartet is equally strong at all repertoire. But when you put together a competition program, they should get a very good sense of ensemble homogeneity and ensemble tightness from the repertoire that you use. And they're not going to get that if you're not really inspired by your repertoire, that you're just doing it. And so to get everybody to buy into the repertoire you're doing is very important. So when we started, making competition programs that worked well for us, we kind of got away from arrangements. We got away from pieces that everybody else was doing. And we started doing repertoire that was maybe a little bit more unique to us. And that worked out well. because now, not only at the competition, are you not one of 7 groups doing recitation book or songs for the coming day, movement 8, but you're also a group that seems to have a clearer sense of their identity. And so I think the virtuosity that everybody was hoping to show, with the last movement of recitation book, we probably showed with Dave Keckley's Rush, as an example. I think we've done that piece probably 500 times because that was one that nobody else was doing. We sounded good on it, and it really shows what a saxophone quartet can do. So I think those are important considerations, and training repertoire doesn't necessarily overlap with competition repertoire. So it's a very good question. And then I have a question here from Greg Reif. Could you speak a bit about what you do concerning educational outreach? What type of programs and other engagements do you offer to students? Yeah, absolutely. And we have a whole section of this on our website too. And we try and come up with things that'll be useful outside of just, talking about the instrument and then playing a bit. And so, for younger students, having some sort of theme or some program, making a bit more interactive, if possible, where they can actually play the instruments. And, everywhere we go in terms of a chamber performance, we'll usually have 1 or 2 outreach activities associated with that. And that'll be, K through collegiate, I'll put it that way. And you want to, especially with younger kids, because the minute you ask for questions, every hand in the room shoots up, even before they've thought of a question. And then when you ask for questions from high schoolers, everyone's afraid to talk because they're worried about seeming cool. So, you maybe leave a little bit more time for questions and demoing with younger students. And then maybe for high school students, you have a bit more of a directed program that you perform. But something where they can engage with the instrument, where they're getting a real clear physical sense of what's going on, and that you may show them all the colors of the instrument. You may use a bit more diverse repertoire that shows a longer range of music. So perhaps your focus for your presentation is less on the instrument and more on presenting 350 years of music in 50 minutes. Go. So I think thinking of it thematically is a very good idea. And we have a few of those spelled out on our website. But in terms of outreach activities that we've also done, we've played at crisis centers, we've played at drug rehab centers, we've played at shelters for abused women, we've played at nursing homes, VA, hospital, everything. And whenever you're playing for these different crowds, you want to think about what in your repertoire would work well, how much do you want to talk, and how useful will the visual component be? Because with younger students, the visual is really helpful. And it helps them maybe stay a little bit more focused than they otherwise would be. But the more advanced the students, the more music and saxophone specific we get. And then we have a question about memorization, how to go about working as an ensemble to achieve that goal. Are there extenuating considerations when memorizing a piece in the chamber setting versus solo setting? That's a very good question. In terms of memorizing as an ensemble, number one is this can't be a gimmick. It can't be a shtick. It can't be a replacement for playing really well. So if you don't play very well from memory, if you don't play your repertoire as well when you play from memory, you still have to work on it, or you shouldn't do it. All right, because this is not a substitute for playing really well. And I think a lot of times people get into it and they're like, oh, wasn't that impressive that I played from memory? It's like, yeah, but I've heard you play a whole lot better with the music. And, I've never gone to an Emerson Quartet concert and thought, oh, geez, it sounded great, but geez, why didn't they play from memory? And so it should be something that's really a part of your identity that you enjoy. In terms of techniques for memorizing as an ensemble, what I mentioned earlier about having a really strong idea, a clear idea as to what your group's interpretation is from the get-go helps the memorization happen a lot more clearly. So when you rehearse with the music initially and are learning it, learning your group's interpretation as an ensemble, be absolutely clear with that, record it. And then when you practice this and are attempting to memorize it, play along with the rest of the group. Yeah, there's the straight ahead, play it a bunch, listen a bunch, and gradually work away from the page for longer and longer stretches of music. But also, while you're learning it, have the other three parts going, have the whole quartet going as you're attempting to do that. And I think that's what would answer the second part of your question, the extenuating circumstances, where when we're learning a concerto from memory, it's rare that the accompaniment has the chance of throwing us off, because it is solo with accompanying ensemble or solo with piano. In a chamber setting, because it's so much more interconnected, you are relying on three other people in a quartet setting to provide, that level of engagement. And if that's not happening, memorization becomes difficult. So I would say you probably need to be practicing along with the full version of the piece a whole lot more as a chamber musician than you would, let's say, if you're memorizing the Dahl concerto, where you can kind of memorize a few, conductor cues, or memorize a few things that happen in the ensemble, or the wind interludes. And then when you're in a chamber setting, every single phrase you play, you need to know how your part works within the group. And the only way that happens is that you play along with the whole piece a lot, or you play along with a string version if you're doing a string quartet. And so I think all of us have incorporated that into our practice a whole lot more because of this quartet than we ever would have, even if we did a whole lot of concertos from memory. And that looks like the extent of our questions. So thanks again for tuning in, everybody. It's gone a little long, I know, but hopefully you found it useful. And, thanks again to our wonderful saxophone online guru, Nathan Knabb, for setting all this up. It's just a wonderful resource. Hope you found this useful. And as always, feel free to send me any further questions, on Facebook or via email. Happy to answer. Hope you're all doing well in this bizarre scenario we find ourselves in. Keep at it, and just realize you play the best instrument on the damn planet. Have a good day, everybody.